Good evening and a very warm welcome to Japan House London. Hello to everybody joining us in the hall this evening and also to those of you joining online. We're live streaming via Zoom. My name is Sam Thorne. I'm Director General here at Japan House London, and it's my privilege to be welcoming an esteemed panel tonight discussing the theme of how can Japan navigate turbulent times in the Indo-Pacific. Very timely subject, I'm sure you'll all agree. It's our pleasure to be inviting back Chatham House. We've been working together for some time now. Before I introduce our chair tonight, Ben Bland, just a few words on Japan House. We opened back in 2018. It's our mission to bring the very best of Japanese cultures to London, to the UK, and to Europe. We host many events like this one. We have exhibitions, and in fact, our current exhibition, Looks Delicious, will be open until 8:30 this evening. It's exploring the culture of food replicas in Japan. It's a wonderful show. This is the last week of the show, so this is one of your last opportunities. So please do stick around for that. What else to say? We will be having a brief drinks reception after the event too, so we look forward to talking more to you then. It leaves me only really to introduce Ben, our chair this evening. Ben is director of Chatham House's Asia-Pacific program, and he'll be chairing this evening's discussion, which will run till about 7:30, 7:45, something like that. Please join me in welcoming Ben and our panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining us in person and online as well. It's great to see lots of familiar faces and many new faces too. And thanks again to Sam and Japan House London for our long-standing partnership. Since I took on this job a couple of years ago, one of the things I've been keen to do is to connect different groups of people interested in and working on Asia in London and throughout the UK. So it's great to work with an organization like Japan House London. So we're going to have about an hour and a bit for our discussion. I'm going to be firing questions at our panelists, who I'll introduce shortly, for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then I'm going to open it up to questions from you all here today in person and online. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I will get to them. But start putting the questions now and we'll come to them in good time. So on to our panelists. First, just to my right here, we have Kanahara Nobukatsu. He's a veteran diplomat and senior official. I'm sure many of you will know him and his work. He's currently the executive director of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and a professor at Doshisha University. He previously served as assistant chief cabinet secretary to the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from 2012 to 2019, and was the inaugural deputy secretary general of the National Security Secretariat. He also had a long career in the Foreign Ministry of Japan with many different roles, including postings in Seoul, Washington, and at the UN. Next to Nobukatsu-san, we have Christy Gavella. She's an associate professor of Japanese politics and international relations at the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies at Oxford University. She specializes in economics, security, and governance in the Indo-Pacific and Japan. And we should commiserate with her because she recently moved over from Hawaii to enjoy our lovely British weather. Last but not least, we have Tsuruoka Michito. He's an associate professor at Keio University and also a former Japanese government official working on the defense side. He previously served as advisor for NATO at the Japanese Embassy in Belgium and was deputy director of the International Policy Division at the Ministry of Defense, as well as being a researcher at the National Institute for Defense Studies, which I think is the MOD's official think tank in Japan. So look, I'm going to start with a very obvious but important question about the United States' new president, Donald Trump. I might come to you first, Nobukatsu-san, to just get your perspective. I mean, how do you see Trump 2.0, and particularly, what do you think his return to the White House means for Japan?
Well, Mr. Trump's, he changed American politics forever, in particular Republicans. And he is addressing to the people in a very low level, because of the smartphone. Those who did not read the papers, they have smartphones. And his voice penetrates into them through smartphones. Kamala could not do that. Hillary could not do that neither. So you have to address to these people. The number is huge. and they are activated politically. So he's addressing to them. His message is very simple. I'm for you. So no more Chinese goods. Tariffs is there from Mexico, Canada, and no more migrants. And the inflation will be down. This is not possible because without migration, without the goods from abroad, the prices will be pushed up. So inflation cannot be defeated, but it doesn't matter because he wants to please them. And shale gas will be flowing in, so the gas price will go down. It doesn't happen because shale gas is so expensive. But he's addressing to these people. Message is very, very simple. I'm for you, and the United States is for you, and this is the new United States. But it does not mean he is totally isolationist. He wants to share burden more in a fair way, saying that the U.S. was 2000s. U.S. was 50% of world GDP. Today, it's 25%. I can't do this all. That's his thinking. So Ukraine, for example, Europeans should take care of them. And he is concentrating upon China because China is the challenger to the United States hegemony. He hates to be called a loser. So he wants to concentrate on China. That's what's going on. So there are two answers to that. One is Europeans should take care of Europe, Putin, and I take care of China, Trump. So Japan should work harder. That's a message from him.
And Christy, what's your sense in what the Trump administration might want from Japan? How do you think they see Japan in their view of the world?
Well, I think that there are a few different aspects. I mean, there are many different people in the Trump administration with different views and different agendas. So I think that's one thing that we have to kind of establish up front. I think that for a lot of structural reasons, Japan is very important to the U.S. As long as the U.S. sees China as its, main competitor, as a challenge, then I think that, there is reason, even from a transactionalist point of view, to think that Japan provides value to the U.S. as a partner, as a country that, is well aligned in a lot of strategic ways. The thing that really throws a wrench into that is this economic nationalism streak in the Trump administration, of course, because, that kind of cuts the opposite way. In a lot of ways, for example, Japan is currently the largest investor in the U.S., so that is very complementary to this transactionalist viewpoint. But it's also true that, they do have a trade deficit. There are lots of other things that put them in the same camp as many other countries that are friendly to the U.S. in general times, but may find themselves challenged in the Trump administration. So I think in the scheme of things, essentially everything is up for grabs in this new administration, but there are reasons to think that Japan has a pretty clear case for providing value, even if that is the metric that the Trump administration wants to use.
Yeah, I was in Tokyo and Seoul recently, and there was a sense that among the US allies, and we know Trump hates allies, or he loves squeezing his allies, that the Europeans are going to have it much harder than the Asian allies, and we're going to be in the firing line first. But what's your sense, Michito-san? How worried are you about Trump coming back to power? Are you relaxed? Do you think Japan can manage it with transactionalism, or do you think there's some bumps in the road ahead?
I'm not very relaxed, so that's for sure, and I have some concerns. But for the moment, the things seem to be going slightly okay. So last Friday, there was a Ishiba-Trump meeting, and that went sort of okay. And also on the very first day of the administration, there was the Quad foreign ministers meeting. So that was a good sign that the new administration is also committed to unilateral things in the Indo-Pacific region. And also on the same day as the US-Japan summit, that there was the US-Australia defense ministers meeting where the AUKUS was reconfirmed. So the US-Japan alliance and the US-Australia alliance, including AUKUS, are sort of now seem to be okay. So that's a good news. So but at the same time, the burden sharing of course, how much you spend on defense, that's really a big issue. And Japan's defense budget is increasing now. And the government says that in 2027 that we are going to reach 2% of GDP. But it's not quite clear whether that's really going to happen. But still, the trend is that Japan's defense budget is going up. But 2% of GDP, is it really enough? That's a huge question, because on one hand, the US is now pushing NATO countries to spend 5% or at least 3 or 3.5% of GDP on defense. And Americans say that the Indo-Pacific region, you have bigger threats and challenges. So then how can you make an argument that it's okay for European and Europeans need to spend 5% or 3% of GDP, but Japan, 2% is okay. It's really difficult to make such an argument. So yes, for the moment that the US is not really pushing Japan to spend 3% or 4% of GDP, but on defense. But this is something that we need to think about.
And Nobukatsu-san, you were a senior official during the first Trump administration. I mean, do you have any tips for the rest of us? How do we manage Trump? How do other allies cope? What's the best way to get what you want out of him?
Abe-san was particularly close to Trump. He was the first leader of the West who met Trump. Trump was, I have to say, the first administration, he knew nobody among the leaders of the world. So Abe-san led him to the International Leaders Club, and they became very close. But Abe-san sent 2 messages to Trump. And one is, Japan is no longer exporter. We are not destroying US automobile companies. We are investor. And together with the UK, Japan and the UK are the 2 biggest investors in the United States, sustaining a large number of jobs in the United States. And Trump changed the image of Japan because of that. Investment, Japan, this is one big message to him. Second message, Abe-san changed the law and the constitutional interpretation. Abe said, your career is guarded by Japanese Navy. Trump said, Trump did not know anything about it. So we changed the image of Japan. We are the staunch ally of the United States, investing a lot in the United States. And that saved us. And the tariff was raised a bit, but it didn't hurt us. And we survived. This time he's ready. He's not amateur. He is now in power. He thinks he knows everything. I'm the strongest president of the United States. And for the moment, it's okay because Ishiba-san is building up upon the Abe-san's and Kishida-san's achievements. But it's not his achievement. That he has to show next year or after next year, if he's the president, he has to show that Japan is useful. And I think it's a mistake, but the Americans need allies. With allies, US is much stronger. Without allies, their influence is limited. But for Trump, useful allies are okay. You're my friends. And useless allies are just a burden. I don't need them. So we have to show that Japan is useful for maintaining American power and influence. We can be called ally, but we have to prove it.
And Christy, do you have a sense? I mean, you talked about all the different people around Trump. What are some of the kind of schools of thought or streams of thinking about China, Indo-Pacific within the Trump administration? Where do you think some of the tension points are going to come in terms of Indo-Pacific policy and Asia policy for the Trump administration?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think that the first thing people usually talk about is the fact that, there are a number of so-called China hawks that have been appointed to this administration who, have strong ideas about what exactly the challenge is with China and what needs to happen. And I would say that, for Japan, those tend to be people who see Japan as a strong partner. But then, as I was mentioning, you also do have people who are very focused on realigning the economic structure of the world, or at least the US, to be more consistent with one that is self-sufficient and, making the US a great energy power and all of these different things. And so in that in that sort of school, I think everyone's place in terms of international partners is much more questionable. I really take what Kanehara-san was saying about, I think everyone has to prove themselves constantly. There's never a time when you sort of be satisfied that, your position is secure. There always has to be another announcement. And then I think that the third one I would point out, I think there are many, but it's just that, in the US, alongside the foreign policy concerns that we're mostly focusing today, there's obviously a lot going on in domestic politics and a lot of attacks on the existing federal structure and the way that government has been doing things traditionally. And I do think that those things will reflect back on foreign policy. So I think that if we think about the Trump administration, it's a source of direct uncertainty for Japan and other countries, because you don't know what policies will be directed towards you. But then there's all this indirect uncertainty because, of course, the Trump administration is likely going to pull out of lots of multilateral organizations. And then domestically, they're changing the lineup in all of these different agencies, or things like USAID, which may be folding. And so I think that there will be a lot of indirect uncertainty as well. And all of these different perspectives I mentioned are sort of fighting within this very busy few weeks that we've had.
I mean, picking up on that point about values, Michito-san, I mean, the UK, like Japan, tends to couch its alliance with the US in terms of values, upholding the international rules-based order or the liberal international order, or defending democracy or the free and open Indo-Pacific. But as Christy said, Trump has already pulled out of international agreements on climate, pulled out of the WHO, or said he's going to, but he's also dismantling the normal structures of liberal democracy within America. So how much do you think, his destruction of those liberal values, both internationally and at home, is going to be damaging for Japan's alliance? Because you can still have the transactional side of it in some ways, but it's going to be very hard for Japanese leaders or other US allies to stand up and say, we're working together to defend a liberal order, when Trump is explicitly dismantling it both at home and overseas.
Yeah, it's quite true that it's already clear that Trump is not at all interested in values in his foreign security policy. And so if you look at the joint leader statement from the Japan-US summit last week, you can't find any word, value or freedom or democracy. It's really a clear change from the Biden period. So de-emphasizing values is one of the characteristics of the Trump's worldview. And also the another aspect is de-emphasizing the global nature of US-Japan alliance. So during the Biden period, that Japan was really active in supporting Ukraine and imposing sanctions on Russia, and that was very much appreciated by the Americans. But the last week's joint the leader's statement that no, it doesn't talk about Ukraine, it doesn't talk about Russia. So Russia appeared only once in the context of North Korea-Russia cooperation. Yes, that's a real concern. But that was it.
But does it matter? I mean, can you have an alliance that's just based on transactionalism, or if it's a long-standing alliance, do you need the values element?
And actually, the Japanese, the sort of mainstream thinking in Japanese, we don't really like value things or human rights diplomacy. So it's not really popular in Japan. So for those people, yes, it's just okay that Trump's not talking about values. It's good. But when it comes to the idea of rules-based international order, this is very much at the heart of Japan's national interest. Because Japan is a country which is not at all prepared to use force to achieve what we want to achieve. So in that sense, it's very different from China, it's very different from Russia, it's very different from the United States. So these are the countries that which are capable of using force. But Japan is not. So that is why. So the keep talking about the rules-based international order is very much at the heart of Japan's national interest. So how Japan could reconcile that position with that of Mr. Trump. So that's going to be a big challenge.
And Nobukatsu-san, I know we were talking earlier about Trump, who's only in office, obviously, in theory, for 4 years. I guess we'll have to see how much he dismantles the democratic system in the US. But where do you think the US is heading in terms of its global role and its role in Asia in the long term? I mean, do you see this as part of a longer term shift to a more isolationist America, where allies in Europe and in Asia will have to just do more to defend ourselves and look after our own security? Or do you think after Trump, there might be a pivot back to something that we would consider more normal in the modern era?
United States is just like a big truck that changes lanes very easily. And now they are on the right side, but they could come back. And it's swinging democracy. It's natural for democracy. And now it's time for Americans to think twice, because their national power is shrinking in proportion. They are growing still, but the other nations are growing faster. China, India, ASEAN nations. So in proportion, they are shrinking. So it's natural that they have to redefine their national interests. We can't do this all. So they are now rethinking again. And it's headed for, to some extent, protectionism and isolationism. That's saying, we can't do this all. I have to protect our industry, people, workers. And now they are readjusting this. But I don't think that they will come back to the Monroe time, or the Americans have read the world, right? A norm today is much better than 19th century. The rule of law and everybody's equal, regardless of skin color, gender, and anything. And this is very different from the early 20th century. Colonial rules and racial discriminations and wars are rampant. And this is over. We have to value this norm, the weight of norm in the international relationship. Americans led it, and together with the Europeans, we were part of that in the latter half of the 20th century. Americans built their nation upon principles. British, Japanese built nations upon rocks. That's the beauty of Americans. I believe that they don't abandon that. They are just readjusting themselves. They can't do this all, but that's fine. But do they go back to that islands continent, cutting off ties with the outer world? I don't think so. They'll come back, but we have to help them.
Yeah. Christy, I mean, do you think that middle powers like Japan, perhaps like the UK, other European nations, can fill some of the gap that's being left by the US in terms of global leadership? Or do we really need the US, and without, it's going to be too hard to coordinate efforts to sustain the sorts of norms and rules that Sam was talking about?
I think they'll have to fill the gap in the areas that they want to. I think that the U.S. will pull back in the areas it feels that are not longer a priority. I think it's not entirely possible that it will happen across the board, though. I think that, for example, the U.S. had a strong interest in space in the first Trump administration, and in the second Trump administration, that seems likely, although maybe now we're going to switch to going to Mars instead of the moon. But I think that, you may see actually that there are some areas where the U.S. is wanting to develop these kinds of kind of global institutions or norms or agreements. But in general, I think, yes, it falls to the rest of the world to decide, what are the things that we value enough to put our political capital and resources behind? What are the things that we feel need to be maintained? I mean, I think that one result of the first Trump administration was that a lot of the countries of the world suddenly got to know each other a lot better because they felt that, they had to figure out how to cope with the situation. And I think that all the countries are more prepared this time than they were before. So I think that they have the potential to use these connections, or the so-called lattice work that the Biden administration created, to facilitate this. It's really just a question of their agency and their will to do so. But certainly if they feel the need to preserve some structures, they'll have to exert some kind of effort.
I want to pivot a bit to talk about the other great superpower that kind of looms in Japan's foreign policy, China. We know that relations have been quite difficult, to put it mildly, in recent years, but it does seem that, I don't know if it's because of Trump being elected, but around the same time, there's been something of a warming in the short term of relations. There've been some high-profile Japanese visits to China, and there's rumors of a possible visit by Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, party and state leader, to Japan this year. Michito, what's your sense and what's going on here? Is Japan feeling out the space for rapprochement? Is this a kind of hedge against risks in the relationship with the US, or is this China also worrying about the risks of its potentially quite unstable relationship with the US?
Yeah, you can say that's you can see some charm offensive sort of a element from China, but the fundamentally that there are various conflicts between Japan and China. So the general prospect is not very good. But of course, it's not in China's interest to have bad relations with all the major Western players. So the US, Europe, Japan. So having bad relations simultaneously is not in China's interest. So that is why it's very natural for China to try to have better relations with Japan and better relations with Europe. So now China is very much making sort of an overture to Europe as well. So it's just natural. But from a Japanese perspective, that it's about our challenge is to have a stable, functioning relations with China. So it's in Japan's interest as well. So but we are not too optimistic.
And Christy, on that point, where do you see the dividing lines within Japan when it comes to the relationship with China? Because obviously, like many countries in Asia, there's security concerns about China, but there's also deep economic integration as well. So where do you see the dividing lines or pressure points within sort of broader Japanese society and community when it comes to how to approach China in the years ahead?
I mean, the classic description has always been that, Japan and China are deeply economically interdependent. So of course, there are businesses that feel that stable relations with China are essential to the future. I think that over time, just like with many other countries, businesses have found that business conditions are deteriorating in China. Wages are no longer as low. There are various kinds of risks. So there's been a gradual process of diversification, but they still are, for various reasons, involved in China because of the economic ecosystem for production, et cetera. So I think there's still that strong voice in Japan. Of course, the security concerns we've already discussed them, so I won't cover them more. I do think among the public opinion, you've also seen a gradual worsening of opinion towards China for various reasons as people have become more aware of various kinds of behaviors that they don't feel are appropriate, or the way that China is behaving near the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, or these kinds of things. So I think there are definitely many voices, but as Michiko said, it's a mixed picture over time, and I think people still feel like there are some big concerns with China, regardless of who you are.
And Nobukawa-san, I mean, I guess you helped oversee in a way a shift to a much tougher policy towards China, but in the medium term for Japan, you can't shift your geography. How does Japan find a modus vivendi with China? How do you go about that? And is that possible, or do you think, do you buy into the more realist arguments that in a sense you're destined as a US ally to fight with China as this rising power that wants to assert its dominance in its own backyard?
Abe-san proposed in his first government, 2004-5, the strategically mutually beneficial relationship, because we can never agree upon values. Democracy is the death of communist dictatorship for them, so they can never accept it. And the Senkaku Island issue, we can never make any concessions against them. But the business is a business. Both sides are making a huge amount of money. So we have to concentrate upon the mutual interests. That was Abe's proposal. And then the relationship improved drastically in the first Abe administration after Koizumi-san shattered Japan-China relationship. And we are continuing that path. But problem is simply that China grew very fast. In the first Abe administration, 2005, China was smaller than us. The end of the Abe administration, second one, China was 4 times bigger than us. And they changed drastically their attitudes. And Chinese worldview is vertical, not flat. One is US, second China, third is maybe Germany, UK, or Europeans, and Japanese are somewhere here. And they suddenly changed. They said, "You are my vassal." I said, "Excuse me, sir, we can't accept it." And then we asked Americans to come closer with us, Europeans, Indians, ASEAN nations. We don't have any hesitations to have good relationship with China because of the business, but we don't make any concessions on values and national security and territory. But we on equal footings, we can be on good terms with China. Happy to do that. So we have to make sure that China, that we are happy to continue this good relationship, in particular on business, but we don't make any concession territory, national security values, and we are with our friends. You can't talk to us one by one, twist our arms, because we are together unified. All the Westerners are unified, together with ASEAN nations possibly, and then we can control relationship with them. But if we are divided, China addresses us one by one, we have to count out the Chinese. This is something that we have to avoid.
And Michio-san, what's your sense? I mean, there are these key flashpoints, I guess, that could see Japan and other US allies in the US come into conflict with China, but you can think about the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, you can think about Taiwan, the South China Sea, maybe even North Korea in some ways. I mean, how worried are you about the risks of conflict in the coming years in Asia?
You mean direct military conflict?
Yeah.
Between China and
between
Japan?
China and the US in Asia, or China and Japan.
Yeah, of course, the possible Taiwan contingency is a huge source of concern for Japanese. And but looking at the Japanese debates on Taiwan, we are still seeing it as a issue of entrapment. So rather than abandonment. So if something really serious happens and the US is involved, then we could be drawn into such a conflict. That sort of mentality is there. So that the late Prime Minister Abe started saying that Taiwan contingency is a contingency for Japan. And now more and more people talk about that. But my impression is that, yes, the political rhetoric about the seriousness of the Taiwan contingency, yes, there has increased quite a lot. But when it comes to the actual level of preparedness for Japan to do substantial things, then there are growing gaps between the political rhetoric and the reality on the ground. So and also that there are the excessive expectations in US and in Taiwan about Japan's possible military role in Taiwan contingency. So, but it's just impossible. I cannot imagine any situation where Japan sent troops to Taiwan. It's just impossible. But some people don't quite understand that. So that is why that there are now the increasing gaps between rhetoric and reality.
I wanted to pivot a bit to talk about another of your neighbors, South Korea. I mean, it was interesting in the last few years, there was the growth of this trilateral cooperation between the US, Japan, and South Korea, which was an interesting example of US allies in Asia starting to work together. There is no NATO in Asia. All the US alliances are purely bilateral. But obviously, since President Yoon in Korea last year had his abortive attempt at martial law, it looks like he's going to be ousted, and there may be a shift of party in Korea to a more sort of Japan skeptical party. But this is something we've seen in the past in South Korea and Japan relations, quite on and off. So what do you will see as the prospects for Japan and South Korea relations, and do you think it's possible that the US can sort of maintain a long-term presence in Asia unless its allies become more networked together? Christy, you're nodding. I might come to you first and get your thoughts.
Yeah, this is something I've written a couple of pieces on lately. It's a really complex situation. I mean, in the short term, South Korea is undergoing a major political crisis. So it's definitely in the short term going to stop this process of trilateral engagement, because they're in the middle of impeachment proceedings. And even if those go through, and I think people are saying sort of late February, they're basically without political leadership until the new government enters office. And so, as you said, people are, I would say, on the whole, pessimistic about this, because it does seem that the former President Yoon was very strongly associated with these trilateral initiatives. And so for various reasons, including the existing domestic political divides in Korea, it seems likely that the next administration will be more, as you said, Japan skeptical or critically focused on historical issues. But, that being said, I think that At the moment, if you look at the baseline after 2 years of intense trilateral engagement with over 70 meetings at all levels between these countries, they're certainly at a baseline better off than they were in 2019 when things were very, very cold. And they have more institutional contact. They have a secretariat, which is now headquartered in Seoul. I think, they have these mechanisms. Again, the question is what they will do with them, if anything. But I do think, again, these were at all levels. So there were people-to-people initiatives, academic exchanges. I was personally part of some of those. I think some of those informal connections will still continue to spin out. So I'm hopeful that even if the situation, ends up being somewhat of a break with trilateral engagement, that perhaps things may not get as cold as they were or as silent as they were for several years.
Do you share the optimism of other panelists for Japan-Korea relations going forward?
As a generation-wise, it is true. The Korean democracy is a very young democracy and heavily ideologically divided. Just like in 1950s Japan, the leftists are very close to North Korea and China, and they believe in their ideology. They are not anti-Japan only. They are anti-America. They are anti-West. They are anti-capitalism. They are still there. The very heavy prism is put on their lens, and they see the world in that way. Youngsters are very different. Young Koreans are very confident of themselves. They feel part of the Western world. They want to be the leader. Join G7, lead the Western world. That's youngsters. And the old-fashioned, of course, the old guards are still there. So Korea is very much divided. So they flip-flop in this way. Yoon Suk-yeol was a staunch conservative leader. He led South Korea to join the Japan, US, Korea, and Australia, Philippines Defense Cooperation. This is exactly against the wish of the leftists. So leftists will pull back the directions. They flip-flop in this way. And I'm sorry to see Mr. Yoon Suk-yeol destroyed himself by martial law. But this is the reality of young democracy. You have to accept it. But if generation changes, Korea will change. And one more thing is, people tend to think that the Taiwanese like Japanese and Koreans hate Japanese. It's not true. 7.5 million Koreans are coming to Japan every year. 7.5 million. 20,000 Koreans are coming to Japan every day. If they hate Japanese, they don't come to us. And so this year, 3 million Japanese are going to South Korea. The people-to-people relationship is warm, and they like each other very much. It's politics. And this politics is loaded with ideology. And this is the generation problem. After 10, 20 years' time, Japan-Korea relations will be much smoother. And we'll talk about reunification of Korean Peninsula together.
Okay, that's a nice optimistic note. I'm just going to ask one more question, then I'll come to the audience. So yeah, put your thinking caps on now. And I just want to come back in a sense to Japanese domestic politics, because I think in the end, all foreign policy is local. And I might come to you on this first, Michito. I mean, Japan's had almost as much chaos in its domestic politics as the UK. I don't know who's had more prime ministers in the last 5 or 10 years, but yeah, people can do the counting. I mean, does that matter, and has that mattered, and will it matter for Japan's foreign policy? Do you think there is likely to be a change of prime minister this year, and do you think that would signal potential shifts in foreign policy, or do you think strategic direction is actually set whoever's in office?
Of course, the domestic politics matters a lot. So if you have a stable, very strong government, so it's good for foreign policy, security policy. That's for sure. That's exactly what was demonstrated by Prime Minister Abe. So we know that. But at the same time, Japan as a country doesn't always have a wide range of choices. So the US is there, China is there, North Korea is there, Russia is there. So we don't have many choices. So in that sense, if we ever sit in the Prime Minister's office, we need to strengthen the alliance with the United States and also try to have stable relations with China. And so these challenges remain. So but at the same time, the elections, so always that the politicians need to think about their own election. So that takes a lot of time and energy. So to what extent that the politicians can they allocate their resources, time, and other things to foreign security policy, that's a huge concern. So yes, so.
And obviously, Prime Minister Ishiba called elections last year and didn't do well. He's now in a minority government. Do you think he's likely to last the rest of this year?
The good news for Mr. Ishiba is that there's no clear alternative. So as long as there's no clear alternative, so your position is sort of secured for the time being. So yeah, that's the situation.
Okay, great. So let's turn to questions now from the audience. Who wants to go first? We've got a question right here at the front. Yeah. And can you just tell us your name and if you have any affiliation? Thank you.
Yes, you should know my affiliation by now, Ben. Anyway, I'm Professor
But can you
Ruth
just tell for the
Taplin.
benefit of our audience?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm Professor Ruth Taplin, Director of the Center for Japanese and East Asian Studies. And I've written lots of books on the subject and all sorts of things. One of the things that you didn't touch on, and there seems to be an interconnection between the United States, Japan, China, India, all the South Korea, is the internet and the social media, because a lot of problems and a lot of misunderstandings seem to be going through, because China has a lot of different, it isn't just TikTok, it's other social media. There's Elon Musk allowing hate to be spread. I don't want to have just concentrate on him, but Twitter, all these things. India has a very strong social media as well. And how do you think, on a people-to-people basis, the big tech companies are infiltrating by allowing social media perhaps to cause problems or cause wonderful friendships?
Christy, do you want to maybe take this question? You've done some work on cyber issues.
Sure. I mean, I think your broad point about basically the information environment has changed a lot. We know that the way people consume information now is very fragmented and potentially subject to manipulation by private companies, by foreign actors, et cetera. So I think that really plays into a lot of the domestic political issues we're talking about in the U.S. too, as well as foreign policy. I think that there has been an intense focus in the U.S. and encouraged among its allies and partners on countering malign foreign influence, trying to combat misinformation or disinformation, mostly with regard to China, Russia, and to some extent infiltration by North Korea. But I think that it's interesting now because it seems like the U.S. is going to change its position on that and not pursue that as much. If you look at recent statements by the State Department that they're actually folding some of their countering misinformation units and things like this, and stopping censorship is the way that they frame it. So I think this is a key issue, but I think we're going to see, as you mentioned, it's not just foreign actors, it's also tech companies, and there are certain actors who have interest in restricting information or shaping it, and others who want to keep it open. And this is going to be a key area for the next 4 years, I think, especially if Elon Musk and other tech companies remain very influential in the U.S. Apparatus.
I'm going to take an online question and I'll come back to the audience. Really interesting question from Professor Driss Larafi, who asks if you think Japan could go nuclear due to changes in the geopolitics and in public opinion in Japan over the long term. Again, and I guess presumably means nuclear weapons, not nuclear power generation. Michito, do you want to take this one?
As long as there is the alliance with the US, Japan, I don't think Japan needs to go nuclear. But of course, if we think beyond the alliance with the US, of course, that could be something that the Japanese might need to think about seriously. But for the moment, I don't think it's in Japan's interest to try to develop nuclear weapons.
Can I jump in? Nuclear issue was taboo for Japan for a long time because of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the Happy Dragon fishing boats, they're exposed to radioactivity or bikini explosion, test explosion by the United States. And now, but the Soviet Union was the European enemy. We are looking at the big ass of Russia, but it's empty. 400,000 soldiers were there. It's not a nuclear war for us. And China was on our side on the latter half of the Cold War period. And this is the first time that we think about nuclear weapons seriously because China is expanding their nuclear arsenal. And we have Taiwan here. It's not European war, it's Asian war. We are frontal. Taiwan and Japan are frontal. Now we have to think, if Xi Jinping threatens us with nuclear weapons, don't do this, don't help Americans. What shall we do? This is the first time that we think about this seriously. Prime Minister Abe just launched this debate. He died, but we have to continue. The first answers are simply to introduce American tactical nukes in the region. And the Americans have only B-61, the free fall dropping nuclear weapons, just NATO weapons. And for us, it's not useful because we are islanders. For South Koreans, it could be useful, but for us, it's not useful. Americans will introduce the air-based nuclear cruise missile and then submarine-based cruise missiles. We have to talk with Americans seriously what kind of weapons should be brought into the region and persuade Chinese don't start nuclear war. And this is the first debate we have. We have to have this. And if this is not enough, then the question is very serious. Should Japan go nuclear or not? But if we go nuclear, we have to abandon NPT system. Then we have to abandon all the nuclear power plants. We can't do that. So we should stick to the American nuclear umbrella. But I have to say, European nuclear umbrella is real. You are exercising this every year, steadfast noon. In Asia, it's only on paper. It's abstract. We have to make this operational now.
Yeah, another question at the front.
Yu Jie, a senior research fellow on China with the Asia-Pacific program at Chatham House. I have a questions for both Japanese guests in here. Now, for Professor Mashito, when you mentioned that Japan would like to construct a stable and functional relationship with China, and that reminds me that what the current UK government has been talking about on this relationship with Beijing right now. But let's leave that aside. I think both countries, both China and Japan now consider the domestic public opinion as being the source that could hugely influence on its foreign policy making. That's certainly for the case for China. And I wonder if that might be the case for Japan as well, given the current perception from Japan towards China wasn't that much, very much in favor or anything at all. So to what extent would you consider that the public opinion within Japan towards China could be somehow become a destabilized factor in terms of foreign policy making?
Yeah, that's really an interesting and good question. That's the Japanese public opinion that is very negative about China is not a new thing. So it's been there for more than decades. So, but still, that during that time, the level of economic interdependence has increased quite a lot, despite the fact that the people have very negative views on China. So I'm not too pessimistic that the Japanese negative perceptions, public perceptions on China are going to disrupt the relationship between the two countries. That's I think what is important is that there's no consensus at all in Japan on how to deal with China. And it's not unique to Japan. So no country has a domestic consensus on how to deal with China. So in Japan, that if you talk to self-defense force people or Coast Guard people, that they keep talking about how dangerous Chinese are, particularly in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Islands. But if you go to Keidanren, the business association, then they just don't want to be disturbed by political tensions between the two countries. So, but both are reality. So of course, it depends on how you define Japan's national interest. But the fact that the business community making a lot of money out of China business, it's still part of a broader, Japan's broader national interest. So it's just a reality. So and it's quite interesting that that reality sort of coincides with the fact that the people have very, very negative perceptions on China, but still the things are going and moving. So that's but it's very important point.
Let's go next. Maybe over here. I'll come to the back next.
Jeremy Pennant, a member at Chatham House. If the tension in the South China Seas continues to rise, do you think Japan should get involved?
Christy.
Sure, sure. So I think the tensions have been high in the South China Sea and continually rising. And I think Japan, has been involved in the sense that it continually calls for parties to resolve disputes peacefully. It calls on them to, uphold the rules of the international order and the mechanisms of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I think that, as my colleagues were saying, in the responses to other questions, in terms of becoming directly involved, there are limitations on what Japan can do there. So what it has been doing is like defense capacity building with Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines that are affected by this, transferring them defense equipment, providing training. So I think it is involved in what it hopes is a preventative and sort of risk mitigating way. Should conflict break out, then it would have all of the same restrictions that were discussed with Taiwan, except even more so because the argument that the South China Sea is a direct threat to the security of Japan is further even than Taiwan. So I think they would face the same limitations in direct involvement.
Okay, maybe right at the back here. And yes, if you just want to wave to the person bringing you the mic.
Thank you so much for the wonderful panel. My name is Yurika Mori. I'm a Japanese student studying at London School of Economics. I have a question about the Indo-Pacific future power dynamics. Like when we talk about like Asia political situation or Indo-Pacific, we still tend to focus on Northeast Asia countries like China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and so on. But there are so many other countries, including India, Indonesia, wherever. Then like many countries are economically rapidly increasing and so on. Like I'd like to hear your like perception about future power dynamics in wider sense of Indo-Pacific region and also the role of like a Japanese leadership in this context.
Yeah, so which are the other powers in the rest of Asia that Japan should be thinking about, and what should Japan be doing in Southeast Asia and with India? Yeah, why don't you go first? Okay.
The basic idea of Indo-Pacific region is we have to expand this liberal international order from the Atlantic community to the Indo-Pacific. This was the basic idea. Then for that purpose, we have to persuade our new leaders. India is coming up. China is turning back against us, but India is coming up. ASEAN nations are coming up. For Japan, important nations are, of course, the advanced nations like South Korea, and then Australia, and then India, next superpower, and then ASEAN nations. ASEAN nations are not unique. We have talked to Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, because they're worried about Chinese dominance of the region. So we are talking to them. Of course, Thailand is important economically, Malaysia is important. And we have to tell them two things. One is this Western free trade system is giving them a big chance to rise in the international order. Our money, technology is going down to them. They become very rich. Our industry is hollowed, but they have become very rich. While the economy is growing because of that. This is because of our free trade system. We have to persuade them in that way. And secondly, our values. This is not white Christian. The Western, the parliamentary system, independent judiciary, rural parties, these are, of course, European great inventions, but they can be very well implanted upon Asian soil simply because we have the same thing like Christians, love and conscience, Buddhists, Hinduists, Islam. We do share these kind of things. The God is in you. This is the teaching of Christianity, right? But Buddha said the same thing. If you have a good spiritual tradition, you can implant the European institutions, make them function. Japan proved it. We have to make this spread all over Asia. Just follow us. Don't go to dictatorship. Dictatorship seemed effective in the short run, but in the end, Soviet Union collapsed overnight. the Assad collapsed overnight. The dictatorship can collapse overnight because they simply cannot absorb people's opinion. We can do that. We have to prove it. But this is our job.
Do we have any more questions? Maybe person in the red jumper, just I think in the third or fourth row, yeah.
Hello. Sorry. I was going to ask,
Do you want to tell us your name?
Oh, sorry, I'm Molly. As America goes more internal, and as, for example, countries like China and India begin to invest in Europe, like in the Baltic states, and that situation is beginning to destabilize, do you think that Japan has they should widen their international outlook to Europe in wake of these events?
Should Japan be doing more in Europe? Michito, do you want to take that?
Yes, since the outbreak of the full-scale invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that the Japan has been very much committed to what is taking place in Europe. I mean, in Ukraine. So by imposing sanctions on Russia and supporting Ukraine, so the level of commitment, I think, has been quite extraordinary. So that's I think one good example. But at the same time, former Prime Minister Kishida often said that today's Ukraine could be East Asia tomorrow. So that's sort of a rhetoric, I think, it's sort of a disappearing and the Trump administration. But still, what is important is that if something really serious happens in Europe, like Russia's invasion of Estonia, for example, then still the US will have to be more engaged in Europe. And that's going to affect US posture in the Indo-Pacific region. And also the vice versa, if something really serious happens over Taiwan, then that is going to influence US posture in Europe. So what this means is that it's in Japan's interest to help deter Russia from invading Estonia or other NATO countries. And at the same time, it's in Europe's interest to help deter China from invading Taiwan. So it's very much about how we could strengthen our deterrence posture, not in individual regions, but how we could build a more sort of a network of deterrence between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. So the linkage between the two theaters have increased quite a lot, and that is recently very much demonstrated by increasing cooperation between Russia and North Korea, and also Russia and China. So when former Prime Minister Kishida started saying that today's Ukraine could be East Asia tomorrow, that sort of element was still not quite visible. But now that we see more visible role that China is playing and North Korea is playing, and that is a great reminder that the two theaters are very much linked with each other.
And obviously Japan's cooperation with NATO has expanded quite a lot, but it's still, quite informal and limited. In the long term, could you ever see sort of a formal alliance system where Japan and European partners actually do, pledge to have some sort of mutual defense agreements?
I'm not a great fan of that, but still, we can do more practical. We can take more practical steps to enhance deterrence in both regions, in Europe and in the Pacific region. So one of the pillars could be a more defense industrial cooperation between Europe and Japan and other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly like South Korea and Australia. Yeah, because now we know that our production capability of weapons and ammunition is really, really lacking. So we need to strengthen our industrial capability. But so how we could do that together, and that is really a important agenda.
Just add on the economic side, I think that there have been a lot of conversations about things like economic security, critical and emerging technologies, et cetera. So, aside from the concrete defense elements, I think that you do hear more conversation across Japan and Europe because they're facing similar challenges. I think that European countries see Japan similarly as a country who has economic interdependence interests with China, but is also, concerned about it. So I think also if we kind of broaden the scope of your question to include economic things, I think that conversation is ongoing and will continue definitely because these are the same struggles that they're facing.
Some points. The NATO has a very clear geographical limits. They can't send troops to Asia. They can't even defend Hawaii because it's not in the Atlantic. But outer space, cyberspace, there are no borders there. So we can cooperate fully in the cyberspace and outer space. And the inside Euro-Asian continent, it's not only Russia who is the enemy of the NATO, because China is helping Russia in the Ukrainian war. And North Korea is sending troops to Ukraine. So we are interconnected. So on both sides of the continent, we have to coordinate our policy.
Great. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. So I'll maybe just take two and then we'll have to wrap it up. So yeah, one right at the front here, and then maybe the lady in the blue and black jumper. And if you keep your questions brief so we get time for the answers, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Ray Mwanza. I'm a student at Imperial College London. Yeah, and my question is, Nobukatsu opened with a view or painting a picture how Trump has really infiltrated his message to the grassroots. And I'm driven to I think a research which was done recently here in the UK. I think it should be just a couple of weeks ago, where the youngsters were asked if they would really love to be led by dictators. And it came out positive. Yeah, it came out positive. And here, Nobukatsu is telling us, let us not go to dictatorship. And one of the views which has come out also is the issue of concession of values. He has touched on it, and I think Mitchell has also touched on it. Now, my question is it possible that Trump is just fitting in a huge gap, which is a vacuum in a way that the leaders who are proponents of democracy are really not feeling in terms of probably being complacent and really being probably neglectful of what is really happening on the grassroots. Yeah, and like it really gave the dynamics of China growing in a faster way. Is it possible that we can see the morphing of people like Trump, the nature of Trump morphing and being really taking their foundations in a bigger way, in such a way that it becomes a norm to have such kind of people like Trump in leadership? Thank you very much.
Right. And we'll take the other question as well. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Sal. I'm a student at UCL. I was just wondering, you spoke a bit about external pressures to increase defense expenditure to at least 2% of GDP. I was wondering, Michito-san specifically, how you would have them pay for it? Like, what would you have them pay for?
Yeah, so do you want to go first? And then we'll come to this question, I guess, and then maybe in a Japanese context of it. Are Japanese leaders complacent about democracy? And yeah, do you worry that Japanese youth in future, like British youth and maybe American youth, might actually find dictatorship or authoritarianism much more appealing than our messy democratic systems? But Michito, maybe do you want to go first? How's Japan going to pay for all this defense spending? What are you going to cut from the budget?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and that is why that's still the government, and particularly the ruling party LDP, hasn't been able to find a clear answer. So we have been talking about the idea of raising some taxes, but there are so many people who oppose to that idea, even within the LDP. So that is really a serious a situation. But I think the way in which we talk about defense budget, I think it's a bit flawed, because if the prime minister and the government as a whole really believes that we need to spend more money on defense, then they need to shift some money from other budget items, because it's about priority. So the prime minister's job is to set priorities, right? So it's politicians' job to allocate limited resources from one area to another. But for the moment, what we have been seeing is that, for example, like saying that if the MOD can find money, you can spend more money. I don't think it's a responsible way. So the prime minister or the government as a whole need to talk to people and try to convince people that yes, that we need to spend more money on defense and we have to find some money. And if you don't want to accept the increase of tax, then we need to slash other budget items. And yeah, so that's sort of a more honest messaging I think is needed. So it's really irresponsible for government leaders, the political leaders, to say that, yes, we are going to spend more money on defense, but you don't need to worry that there will be no tax increase. Without cost, we can do more on defense. It's just impossible. So we need to face the reality.
The politicians need art. Abe-san raised twice consumption tax from 5 to 8, 8 to 10. He secured 10 trillion yen of tax revenue. He gave 10% to the defense ministry. But at the same time, he printed huge amount of money. And then the Nikkei index was 8,000 yen when he took power. When he left the government, it was 40,000 yen. So economy is okay. You have to combine all these things. You have to compel people to pay tax for defense. People say no, outright. But you have to combine many economic policies, financial policies, and eating up people's life. Then ask them to pay a bit more. It's not only for defense. Defense is only, it's only 20 or 25% of the social welfare budget. It's huge. We're running huge deficit every year. We can't make our kids pay that debt. So it's not only defense, it's a whole social welfare. We have to raise tax for sure. And the political leaders hate to raise tax because they can be defeated in the elections. But sometimes we have to face the reality, as Tsuruoka-san said.
And on the second question about democracy, I mean, are there any fears in Japan that the sort of rise of the far right or extreme political views that we've seen, obviously in the US and across Europe, obviously Korea saw an attempt at martial law. Is there any fear in Japan about, losing young people or young people becoming complacent about democracy?
For Japanese, the memories of the imperial time in the Pacific War, in particular from 1941 to 1945, 4 years, oppression of the government was very vivid in the memories. I don't think the Japanese will go for dictatorship.
Well, I think we've run out of time there, but thanks so much for all your questions online and in the room. And please join me in giving a round of applause to our great panelists.